The
You
ballroom of
don't
the Grand
belong
Meridian
here.
Conference Center in
Adrian doesn't
Chicago
need this
holds
kind of
more than
disruption
800
today. No, you
executives,
can't.
and every one
I
of them
have to.
is waiting for Adrian Cross.
Oh my God!
Victoria Langford Cross moves through the crowd near the private entrance, 5 months pregnant, carrying a small gift box in one hand and Adrian's forgotten presentation drive in the other. Inside the box is an ultrasound photograph she has been waiting 3 days to give him. She has called him 11 times since morning. He has not answered once. A woman steps directly into her path. "You don't belong here," Vanessa Cole says, loud enough that the nearest tables turn to look. Adrian doesn't need this kind of disruption today. "I'm not here to disrupt anything," Victoria answers, her voice calm and even. "I'm his wife." Vanessa laughs, sharp enough to draw more attention. His wife stays home. Everyone here knows that. Victoria doesn't raise her voice. "You're about to make a mistake you can't undo before sunrise," she says quietly. Vanessa hears an insult, not a warning. Her hand closes around Victoria's wrist. The gift box falls, the small photograph inside, sliding across the marble floor as phones rise to record it. The ballroom goes silent. Adrian arrives seconds too late to stop it, and seconds too early to stop what happens next. He looks at his mistress. He looks at his wife. Then he turns to security. "Please escort her out. She's not well." Victoria says nothing. She looks past him, toward a sponsor banner near the stage, and reaches for her phone. "Yes," she says quietly into it. "Move forward. Tonight." Somewhere across the city, a phone begins ringing that hasn't rung in 3 years, a number tied to the anonymous investor who once saved Adrian's company from collapse. By morning, everyone in that ballroom will learn who Victoria Langford Cross really is. But Adrian's greatest shock will not be discovering his wife's fortune. It will be discovering exactly how much she already knew about him. Before we continue, tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and if you were Victoria, would you reveal the truth immediately, or wait until everyone exposes themselves first? The ballroom of the Grand Meridian Conference Center in Chicago holds more than 800 executives, and every single one of them is waiting for Adrian Cross to walk onto that stage. Chandeliers throw soft light across round tables dressed in white linen, and at the front of the room, a banner reading American Innovation Summit hangs above a podium built for a man who has spent 15 years learning exactly how to stand in front of a crowd and make them believe whatever he wants them to believe. Victoria Langford Cross moves through that crowd near the private entrance, 5 months pregnant, carrying a small gift box in one hand and Adrian's forgotten presentation drive in the other. Inside the box is an ultrasound photograph she has been waiting 3 days to give him in person. She has called him 11 times since morning. He has not answered once, and each unanswered call has quietly chipped away at the explanation she keeps offering herself. She had rehearsed this moment in her mind the entire drive from the airport, imagining Adrian's face when he saw the small gift box in her hands, imagining the way he might pull her into a side room just to hold her for a moment before his speech. She had allowed herself, for the length of that drive, to believe the best version of the evening that was still possible between them. She tells herself there is a simple reason for his silence: a dead phone battery, a packed schedule, too many people pulling at his attention on the biggest night of his career. She has believed simple explanations before, and for a long time, believing them was easier than asking the harder questions sitting underneath them. A woman steps directly into her path before she reaches the reserved entrance. "You don't belong here," Vanessa Cole says, loud enough that the nearest tables turn to look. Adrian doesn't need this kind of disruption today. Of all days. "I'm not here to disrupt anything," Victoria answers, her voice calm and even, despite the sudden tightening in her chest. "I'm his wife." Vanessa laughs, sharp enough to draw more attention from the surrounding tables. His wife stays home. Everyone in this room knows that. Adrian has told us himself, more than once, that his marriage is practically over. Victoria does not raise her voice, though something behind her eyes goes very still, the way water goes still right before it freezes. "You're about to make a mistake you can't undo before sunrise," she says quietly, almost gently, as though she is warning a stranger away from a step that isn't there anymore. Vanessa hears an insult, not a warning. She has spent a year building a story in which Victoria is a fragile, forgettable footnote, and nothing in that story leaves room for a warning she doesn't understand. Her hand closes around Victoria's wrist, hard enough to leave a mark. The gift box falls. The small photograph inside slides out across the polished marble as dozens of phones lift at once to record it. The ballroom around them goes quiet, in that particular way a room goes quiet, only when something has gone badly, publicly wrong. Adrian reaches them seconds later, too late to stop what has already happened, and, in the end, unwilling to try to make it right. He looks at Vanessa. He looks at his wife, still catching her breath against the edge of a display stand, one hand pressed instinctively over her stomach. Then he makes the choice that will define everything that follows. He puts a hand lightly on Vanessa's shoulder and turns to the nearest security officer. "Please remove her," he says, nodding toward Victoria. "She's not well. The pregnancy has made her emotional, and I don't want this to become a bigger scene than it already is." Victoria says nothing to him directly. She looks past his shoulder, toward a sponsor banner rising above the stage, silver letters on navy blue spelling out Langford Capital, the company whose money is quietly paying for every chair, every camera, and every plate of food in that room. Then, calmly, she reaches into her coat pocket for her phone. "Yes," she says quietly into it, to someone on the other end who has clearly been expecting her call for some time. "Move forward. Tonight." She is not calling for revenge. Not yet. Compliance at Langford Capital had flagged an irregular transfer out of Crosswell that same morning. A routine red flag she had planned to review quietly, on her own schedule, without ever needing to set foot in this ballroom at all. What just happened in this hallway is what decides, in this instant, that quiet was no longer the right approach. Adrian believes, in this moment, that he has simply removed an embarrassing wife from an important night in his career. He has no idea that the company financing this entire summit ultimately answers to her. He has no idea that the woman he just had escorted out of a ballroom is the reason his company still exists at all, 3 years after it should have collapsed under its own weight. By morning, every executive who watched this happen will know exactly who Victoria Langford Cross is. But Adrian's greatest shock will not be discovering his wife's fortune. It will be discovering exactly how much she already knew about him, and how long she had known it, before she ever chose to say a single word. 3 questions will define the next 24 hours of Adrian Cross's life. Why did Victoria hide who she really was from the man she married? Why did Adrian choose to protect the woman who attacked his pregnant wife, instead of defending her in front of hundreds of witnesses? And what, exactly, had Adrian and Vanessa quietly been doing with millions of dollars that were never theirs to spend? There is a 4th question, too, one that will not fully surface until the very end of this story, long after the board meeting, long after the divorce papers are signed. It has nothing to do with money, and everything to do with how long a person can quietly watch someone they love become a stranger before they finally decide to stop pretending otherwise. Within a day, the conference will be suspended. Adrian will lose control of his own board. Vanessa will face both a police complaint and a financial investigation launched from inside her own company. And Victoria's identity will be revealed in front of the very executives who watched her humiliated only hours before, in a room built entirely on her family's money. But her revenge will uncover something far worse than an affair. A transfer of company money had been quietly arranged only hours before Adrian ever walked onto that stage. Someone had already been preparing to take control of everything he built and disappear with what remained of it, long before the ballroom ever went silent. What none of the executives applauding Adrian's keynote that same evening understood was how quickly the ground beneath his career had already begun shifting. The version of Adrian Cross they believed they were watching was already, at that exact moment, further from the truth than any of them could have guessed. Somewhere in that same building, evidence was already accumulating that would unravel every part of the story he had spent 15 years perfecting. If you're watching this from anywhere in the country right now, drop a comment telling us where you're tuning in from tonight, because the story behind that ballroom moment actually started 7 years earlier, in a much smaller room, with a much quieter, much more convincing version of Adrian Cross. Victoria met Adrian at a charity dinner in Boston. raising money for a children's hospital in a room far smaller and far less polished than the one he now fills with his ambition. Round tables, a small string quartet, a silent auction table nobody paid much attention to. She introduced herself simply as Victoria Langford, a consultant who helped small foundations manage their giving wisely. She did not mention that her late father, Harrison Langford, had built one of the largest private investment firms in the country, or that she was his only child and sole surviving heir to nearly everything he left behind. Adrian was 38 that night, hungry in the way ambitious young executives often are, and still genuinely likable in a way that would later harden into something colder and more calculated. He told her, over a glass of wine neither of them finished, that he wanted to build a company that created real jobs and treated people fairly, not just a company that made him personally rich. He said character mattered more to him than money ever could, that he had watched too many executives lose themselves chasing numbers on a spreadsheet. Victoria believed him completely, because she desperately wanted to believe that kind of man still existed. Before their wedding, she quietly signed an agreement keeping the Langford family trust entirely separate from the marriage. Adrian assumed she had received a modest inheritance, enough for comfort, but nothing that would ever change the shape of his own ambitions. Victoria never corrected the assumption. She wanted, more than she wanted almost anything else in her life, to know whether a man could love her without knowing what she was worth on paper, without that number ever entering the room with them. Their wedding took place on a quiet afternoon at a small chapel outside Boston, nothing like the grand events Adrian would later attend as a matter of routine. Victoria wore her mother's dress, altered just slightly at the waist, and Adrian stood at the front, looking nervous, in a way that had nothing to do with performance. He told her, in his vows, that he intended to spend his life earning the kind of trust most men never bother to try for. Raymond, standing near the back with her late father's absence sitting heavily on his shoulders, remembered thinking that the young man at the altar actually meant every word of it. For a long time, he did. Their early years together were genuinely happy. They built a quiet life outside the spotlight while Adrian worked, day and night, to launch Crosswell Technologies from a rented office with 3 employees and a business plan most banks refused to take seriously. Victoria sat with him at their kitchen table more nights than she could count, helping him rewrite pitch decks until 2 in the morning, believing every word of what they were building together. She never once told him how many of his early ideas she had quietly helped shape, because she never wanted him to feel like anything other than the architect of his own success. But children did not come easily for them. Victoria endured years of appointments, procedures, and losses she rarely spoke about, even to him, because grief that quiet has a way of becoming invisible, even to the person living inside it. After the 3rd loss, she stopped attending Adrian's public events entirely, unable to bear one more polite question at one more cocktail hour about when they planned to start a family. Adrian told her, gently at first, that she was overreacting, that people were only making conversation. She stopped going anyway. Adrian began describing her absence to colleagues as a lack of support. He never said it to her face. He said it in rooms she wasn't in, at dinners she hadn't been invited to people who would, years later, repeat it back to her without realizing exactly how much damage those small, casual comments had already done to the way he saw his own marriage. Victoria believed her privacy was protecting what they had built together. In reality, it was giving Adrian room, quietly and slowly, to rewrite the story of who she was into something smaller and more forgettable than the truth. 3 years before the conference, Crosswell Technologies stood on the edge of collapse. A flagship product launch had failed publicly and painfully, the banks had refused 2 separate rounds of emergency financing, and employees had begun quietly updating their resumes in the break room when they thought no one else was watching. Adrian came home one night looking like a man who had lost everything he had spent 15 years building, and for the first time in their marriage, he cried in front of her without trying to hide it, his shoulders shaking against her collarbone in their dark kitchen. Victoria held him that night and said very little. What she did next, she never told him. She called Raymond Shaw, the attorney who had served her father loyally for 3 decades, from a locked office at 2 in the morning, while Adrian slept upstairs. She instructed him to arrange an emergency investment of $85 million into Crosswell through a confidential holding company with no visible connection to the Langford name whatsoever. Raymond asked her once, carefully, whether she was certain she wanted to protect a man without ever telling him the truth about where his rescue had come from. "If he never knows it was you," he said, "he'll never have the chance to thank you for it. He may never even understand what he owes." "I don't want his gratitude," Victoria answered. "I want to know, once and for all, whether he'd still be the man I married once the company is safe again, or whether the money is the only thing holding him together. If I tell him, I'll never actually find out." Raymond didn't argue further. He had known her father well enough to recognize the same quiet, immovable resolve in his daughter, and he drafted the agreement exactly as she asked, adding the protective conditions himself without needing to be told twice. The agreement gave Langford Capital the right to assume controlling ownership if Adrian ever violated specific ethical or financial conditions written carefully into the fine print, conditions Adrian barely read before signing, desperate as he was for the money to simply arrive before payroll ran out. Adrian never learned who had actually saved him. He was told only that an anonymous investment committee had reviewed his business and believed in its future. He accepted the funding, rebuilt the company piece by piece, and within 18 months, business magazines were calling him a self-made visionary who had pulled his own company back from the edge through nothing but sheer will and discipline. He gave interviews about resilience. He talked about sleepless nights and hard choices, about waking up at 4 a.m. to personally answer customer complaints, about refusing to accept a single dollar of outside help he hadn't earned through his own persistence. One widely shared profile called him proof that discipline alone could still rebuild an empire from ash. He never once mentioned his wife in any of it, not even in passing, as though the years she had spent beside him through the company's hardest stretch had simply never happened at all. Success changed him gradually, in the way it often does, so slowly that Victoria almost didn't notice until it was already finished changing him completely. He began traveling more. He stopped inviting her to company dinners, telling himself, and eventually telling her, that these events simply weren't her kind of thing, that she would be bored, that it would be easier for everyone if she stayed home. Her quiet nature, once something he called grounding, slowly became, in his own private accounting, something closer to distance, something he mentioned to colleagues with a small, practiced sigh. Then Vanessa Cole joined Crosswell Technologies as communications director, and everything accelerated at a pace Victoria never saw coming. Vanessa arrived at Crosswell with an impressive resume and a carefully rehearsed sense of confidence that made her seem, from the very first meeting, like exactly the kind of hire a growing company needed. She had done her research before ever walking through the door, studying every public profile of Adrian Cross, every magazine feature, every panel appearance, until she understood precisely which version of himself he wanted the world to see. She built her first pitch to him around that exact version, telling him he had been undersold by his own team for years, that a man with his story deserved a much bigger stage. Adrian, flattered in a way he hadn't been in years, hired her within the week. Vanessa had grown up watching her own mother stay quietly loyal to a man who never once rewarded that loyalty, and she had promised herself early on that she would never make the same mistake. Somewhere along the way, that promise had curdled into something else entirely, a belief that taking what she wanted, by whatever means necessary, was simply the alternative to being left behind the way her mother had been. It was not an excuse she ever said aloud, but it was the story she told herself late at night, whenever a small, quiet part of her recognized exactly what she was doing to another woman who had never done anything to her. Vanessa did not simply want Adrian's attention. She wanted the empire she was convinced he already owned outright, free and clear, and she was patient enough to spend more than a year quietly building toward it, one dinner and one photograph at a time. She reshaped Adrian's public image within her first year at the company. She arranged interviews with major business outlets, booked him for keynote panels across the country, and filled his calendar with private dinners where investors and journalists competed for a few uninterrupted minutes of his time. She taught him how to answer difficult questions without actually answering them. She taught him how to look humble on camera while saying almost nothing humble at all. Somewhere inside that packed, glittering schedule, Professional closeness turned into something else entirely, and neither of them stopped it once it started, both of them telling themselves it meant less than it did. The evidence built slowly, the way these things almost always do. Hotel reservations under both their names at conferences where only Adrian was supposed to attend, always on separate floors, always quietly close together. Late-night calls that ran 2 and 3 hours past any reasonable business purpose, calls Adrian took in the garage instead of the house. A diamond bracelet charged to a corporate expense account and coded, quietly, as a client gift for an account that didn't actually exist. A photograph, later recovered from a deleted account, showing Vanessa wearing the exact anniversary necklace Adrian had given Victoria only months earlier, the clasp catching the light of a hotel bar somewhere in Denver. A message on his company phone that referred to Victoria only as the obstacle, never once by name, never once as a person. Daniel Brooks, the company's chief financial officer, questioned several of these expenses as they crossed his desk, the way any careful executive would when the numbers stopped adding up cleanly. He brought a folder into Adrian's office once, laid it flat on the desk, and asked, as gently as he knew how, whether Adrian wanted him to keep approving charges that didn't match any real client work. "I need you to trust me on this one," Adrian told him, not looking up from his monitor. "Vanessa's building relationships that matter more than a line item on a spreadsheet." "I trust you," Daniel said. "I just need to be able to explain these numbers if anyone ever asks me to." "Then make sure no one asks," Adrian said, and the conversation ended there. Daniel did as he was told, though the discomfort of it followed him home most nights, and sat with him at dinner while his own family talked around him, unaware that he was quietly building his own private file of everything that didn't add up, just in case a day ever came when someone finally did ask. One night, several months before the conference, Victoria found a hotel receipt in Adrian's jacket pocket while gathering laundry, a charge from a city he'd told her he never visited that week. She asked him about it over dinner, as calmly as she could manage, and he explained it away so quickly, so smoothly, that she almost believed her own suspicion had been unfair to him. She wanted, more than she wanted to be right, to trust the man across the table from her, and for one more season, she let that wanting win. At home, Victoria noticed her husband becoming harder to reach, harder to read, harder to sit across a quiet dinner table from without feeling like she was sharing a house with a stranger, wearing her husband's face, and using his old, familiar voice. And then, after years of trying and losing and trying again, she discovered she was finally genuinely pregnant, and for one bright evening, none of the distance between them seemed to matter at all. A few months before that, Victoria had asked Adrian, quietly and without accusation, whether he thought they should see someone together, a counselor, anyone who might help them find their way back to each other. Adrian had agreed in the moment, then rescheduled the first appointment twice, before letting it disappear from his calendar entirely, always with a reason that sounded, on its own, perfectly reasonable. Victoria stopped asking after the second cancellation, telling herself that some things simply had to wait until the company's busy season passed. The busy season, she would later realize, had never actually ended. She planned to tell him during a quiet dinner at home, the kind of evening they had not shared in months, the kind she had spent an entire afternoon preparing for. Adrian canceled it 2 hours before it was supposed to happen, citing preparation for the Chicago conference, his voice distracted and half elsewhere on the phone. Victoria decided, instead of waiting for another night that might never actually come, that she would surprise him there instead, drive to Chicago herself, and tell him in person the way she had always imagined she would, with the ultrasound in her hand and nothing standing between them. She had no idea that Vanessa had already told the summit's organizers she would be attending the closing gala as Adrian's partner, or that her own name had already been quietly removed from the guest list weeks in advance, a single line deleted from a spreadsheet by someone who had learned exactly how the seating charts worked. 3 weeks earlier, Vanessa had sat across from the summit's event coordinator with a printed guest list between them, running her finger down the page as though she were simply double-checking details. "Mr. Cross's office asked me to update a few entries," she said smoothly, sliding a note across the table. "His wife won't be attending this year. Please remove her name from the reserved section entirely, and don't list her as a +1 under any table." The coordinator, seeing nothing unusual in a communications director handling logistics, made the change without a second thought, never once verifying the request with Adrian himself. Vanessa had planned every detail of that weekend with the same quiet precision, down to which photographers would be seated closest to the head table during the closing gala, and which reporters would be given the best angle for photographs of her standing beside him. She had rehearsed, more than once in the mirror of her hotel room, exactly how she would describe herself if anyone asked who she was to Adrian Cross. She had never once rehearsed what she would do if his actual wife showed up at all, because in the story she had built for herself, that possibility simply didn't exist anymore. Victoria arrived at the Grand Meridian, carrying the presentation drive Adrian had left behind that morning, the small gift box holding their ultrasound photograph, and a handwritten note she had planned to leave at his seat if she couldn't find him before the keynote began. Her name was missing entirely from the guest list. A young staff member checked twice, apologized twice, and finally suggested, not unkindly, that perhaps there had been some mistake with her invitation. Vanessa had arranged the seating chart herself weeks earlier and had quietly removed the one reservation that didn't fit the story she was telling everyone around her. When Victoria tried to make her way toward the private entrance anyway, staff treated her the way people treat someone who clearly doesn't belong in a room built for importance. Vanessa noticed her almost immediately and made certain everyone nearby noticed too, stepping directly into her path with the easy confidence of someone who has never once been told no. The confrontation began with a kind of brittle politeness that curdled fast into something else entirely. Vanessa told Victoria, in front of a widening circle of onlookers, that Adrian was embarrassed by her absence from public life, that a wife was more than a name on a certificate, that she needed to belong beside the man she married in more than paperwork alone. She said it like a woman rehearsing a line she had been waiting a long time to deliver. Victoria answered without raising her voice, though every word landed with weight. And a mistress is still a mistress, no matter where she's seated. What happened next was already the moment burned into the memory of everyone standing in that hallway. The grab, the falling gift box, the phones rising to record it, Adrian arriving only to choose Vanessa in front of his own pregnant wife, and the wedding ring pressed into his open palm a moment later. The clearest record of all belonged, as it turned out, to the venue's own private security cameras mounted quietly above the entrance, watching everything without a single gap. A few feet away, Dr. Elaine Foster stepped out of a side conversation in time to see only the end of it, enough to sense that something was wrong without yet understanding how wrong it truly was. She started forward instinctively, the way anyone would, before a colleague caught her arm and murmured that security was already on its way. She hesitated, a decision she would spend the rest of that night quietly questioning. She left the ballroom without telling a single person in that room who she really was, walking past the sponsor banner with her family's name printed across it in silver letters. No one there had thought to connect to her. Within the hour, Victoria began experiencing sharp pain and was taken by ambulance to a hospital several blocks from the conference center. A nurse asked her, gently, if there was anyone they should call. Victoria gave Raymond's number instead of Adrian's, and something in that small decision told her everything she still needed to know about where things stood. The attending physician checked the monitor twice before speaking, then finally offered a small, reassuring smile. "Your baby's heart rate is strong," she said. "Given the stress you've been through tonight, I'd like to keep you overnight, just to be safe." "Thank you," Victoria said quietly, and then, because the doctor's kindness nearly undid her composure, she added nothing else, staring instead at the ceiling tiles until the room emptied and she was finally alone with the sound of the monitor. Doctors confirmed the baby was safe, but recommended overnight observation as a careful precaution. Adrian did not come with her. He stayed behind at the Grand Meridian to deliver his keynote address and contain what he still believed, wrongly and with a confidence that would not survive the night, was a small and manageable public relations problem. Standing at the podium less than an hour later, he told the room that true leadership meant showing up for the people who depended on you, especially in moments that tested you the most. The audience applauded warmly, several of them already aware of the confrontation in the hallway, but assuming, as he clearly intended them to, that his composure in front of them now was proof of exactly the character he was describing. Not one person in that ballroom knew that the woman he was supposedly showing up for was, at that exact moment, lying in a hospital bed several blocks away, with no one from his family beside her. Vanessa, meanwhile, pressured the venue's security team to delete the footage of the confrontation entirely, insisting to anyone who would listen that Victoria had started the altercation herself and that the recordings would only embarrass the company for no good reason. She used Adrian's name twice while making the request, as though his authority might make hers heavier. For several hours, the only clips circulating online appeared to begin after the confrontation was already underway, conveniently supporting the version of events she was carefully constructing in real time, one deleted second at a time. Adrian released a short public statement calling the incident a private family matter connected to emotional distress during a difficult pregnancy. For a while, it worked exactly as intended. Public sentiment online turned sharply against the unnamed pregnant woman, who had, according to the story now spreading, disrupted an important industry event for reasons no one understood or bothered to ask about. But Dr. Elaine Foster, the conference's chairwoman, had witnessed part of the confrontation herself from across the hallway, and the version now circulating didn't match what she had seen with her own eyes, not even close. She had built her entire career on paying attention to details other people rushed past, and she was not about to stop now. She began quietly asking her own security team pointed questions that Adrian's people had clearly hoped no one would think to ask so soon. Dr. Foster called the security office directly that same evening and asked, without accusation in her voice, whether standard incident protocol had been followed for what happened near the private entrance. The young technician on duty hesitated only a moment before confirming that, yes, a backup copy always existed for any incident involving physical contact between guests, regardless of who requested a deletion afterward. It was company policy, he explained, precisely so that no single person could quietly erase what had actually happened. What nobody involved in the cover-up realized was that this same technician, following standard protocol without a second thought, had already made a protected copy of the complete, unedited footage before receiving any request to delete it, exactly as procedure required for any incident involving physical contact. That footage showed everything. Vanessa starting the confrontation. Vanessa knocking the ultrasound gift from Victoria's hand. Adrian arriving in time to witness the full aftermath. And Adrian only minutes later, standing near a service hallway, quietly instructing a staff member to make the footage disappear entirely before anyone outside the building ever saw it. By the time that footage reached the people who mattered most, assault would no longer be the most serious problem facing Adrian Cross, not by a long distance. At the hospital, Raymond Shaw arrived at Victoria's bedside, carrying information that changed the shape of everything that came after. He set his briefcase down carefully, pulled a chair close to the bed, and told her, without any of his usual gentleness softening the words, that unusual payments had been flagged that same morning by Langford Capital's internal compliance team, the kind of automated alert that almost never triggered for a company as carefully managed as Crosswell had become under new leadership. Adrian had personally authorized a transfer of $12 million to a consulting firm registered under his mistress's brother, disguised on the books as a conference expansion expense. Daniel Brooks had refused to approve the transfer through normal channels, flagging it immediately as irregular in a written memo that would later matter a great deal. Adrian had used an emergency executive override to push it through anyway, bypassing the one person on his team positioned to stop him before it went any further than a spreadsheet entry. Raymond explained, carefully and without exaggeration, that this transfer violated the specific conditions written into Langford Capital's original investment agreement 3 years earlier, the same agreement Adrian still believed had come from a nameless committee with no connection to anyone he actually knew or had ever met in person. Under those terms, Victoria now held the legal authority to freeze the transfer immediately, strip Adrian of his executive powers, demand a complete forensic audit of the company's finances, and take temporary operational control of Crosswell Technologies until the situation was fully resolved to everyone's satisfaction. She hesitated for a long moment, not out of doubt, but because thousands of employees who had done nothing wrong depended on that company for their livelihoods, for their mortgages, for their children's tuition. It would have been easy, in that moment, to let anger make every decision for her, to dismantle the entire company simply because the man running it had betrayed her so completely. But her father had taught her, long before any of this began, that real power was measured not by how much damage a person could cause, but by how precisely they chose to use it. Her revenge, she decided in that quiet hospital room with a monitor tracking her baby's heartbeat somewhere behind her, could not be allowed to destroy people who had never done a single thing to harm her. Alone for a moment after Raymond stepped out to make his calls, Victoria found herself thinking of her father, of the way he used to say that money revealed people faster than any conversation ever could, that it simply showed you, sooner or later, exactly what someone valued when they thought no one important was watching. She had spent 7 years testing that theory on the one relationship that mattered most to her, and she finally, fully understood the answer he had given her. She gave Raymond one instruction from her hospital bed, calm and unwavering. Protect the employees, freeze the money, and call the board. Adrian returned to his hotel suite that night, expecting a difficult conversation with his wife, followed eventually, he assumed, by an apology once she had calmed down and thought things through properly. Instead, his keycard no longer opened the door. He tried it 3 times before a manager, apologetic and clearly uncomfortable, explained that the reservation had been altered by the account holder. His company phone had been remotely locked without warning, halfway through a text message he never finished sending. When he called the private airfield to arrange his flight home, he was informed the corporate jet had been grounded on the orders of an emergency directive he did not recognize and could not override no matter whose name he invoked. His assistant called soon after, her voice careful in the way people get when they're delivering news they'd rather not be responsible for. "There's an emergency board meeting scheduled for 8 o'clock tomorrow morning," she said. "I wasn't looped in on who called it. I just know it's not on anyone's usual calendar." "Find out who called it," Adrian said. "Tonight, if you have to." She called back 40 minutes later, her voice quieter still. The answer that came back was a name he had heard exactly once before, 3 years earlier, in a single sentence from his own legal team, and never again since that day. Langford Capital. He tried, without success, to reach the anonymous chairman who had rescued his company once already, assuming, in his growing panic, that a second rescue might still be possible if he simply explained himself well enough to whoever was finally listening on the other end of the line. He called the law firm that had handled the original paperwork 3 years earlier, the same firm whose senior partner had once told him, in a brief and formal phone call he still remembered clearly, that the investment committee preferred to remain anonymous and did not take direct meetings with the executives it funded. That partner did not return his call that night, or the next morning either. Adrian sat alone in his hotel room for a long stretch after that, turning the same question over without finding an answer he liked. He had spent 3 years telling reporters, investors, and eventually himself that he alone had rebuilt Crosswell Technologies out of nothing but discipline and refusal to quit. He had never once wondered, seriously, who had actually written the check that made any of that rebuilding possible in the first place, because wondering would have meant admitting he owed someone a debt he could never fully repay. At that same hour, Victoria's phone rang beside her hospital bed. She looked at the screen. She let it ring, watching it go dark again in silence. Vanessa, panicking as the $12 million transfer showed frozen across every internal system she still had access to, called Adrian in his hotel room and told him they needed to place the blame entirely on Daniel Brooks before the board meeting began, her voice rising with every sentence. For the first time since the affair had started, Adrian allowed himself to wonder, quietly and with real dread settling into his chest, whether Vanessa had simply been using him to reach money that had never actually been his to give away in the first place. Before he could confront her about any of it, the complete, unedited conference footage was delivered quietly to Dr. Foster, to Raymond Shaw, and to every member of the emergency board, each of them watching, in their own separate rooms, exactly what Adrian had spent an entire night trying to erase from existence. By sunrise, Adrian was no longer fighting to save his marriage. He was fighting to understand exactly who his wife had been all along, and how much of his own celebrated success had quietly depended on her from the very beginning of everything he thought he had built alone. The emergency meeting was held the next morning in the same building's main executive hall, only one floor above the ballroom, where everything had first unraveled less than a day earlier. Adrian arrived with Vanessa beside him, still believing, against every warning sign stacked in front of him, that he would be defending himself before a room of outside investors he had simply never had the chance to meet in person before now. The board members were already seated when he walked in, their faces giving nothing away, coffee cups untouched in front of most of them. Raymond placed a thick folder of evidence at the head of the table without a single word of explanation, and the sound of it landing on the wood seemed louder than it should have been. Then Victoria entered the room. She looked composed, dressed for business rather than recovery, accompanied by a doctor-approved assistant who stayed quietly near the door. No one in that room treated her like an unwanted guest this time. Every head turned. No one spoke. Dr. Foster rose to greet her formally, introducing her to the room as Victoria Langford Cross, chairwoman and controlling beneficiary of Langford Capital, the firm controlling 61% of Crosswell's voting shares, and therefore the outcome of every decision made at that table. For a moment, Adrian genuinely believed there had been some kind of mistake, some clerical confusion that a single phone call could still untangle if he just stayed calm long enough. Then Raymond displayed the ownership documents on the screen behind him, one page at a time, in silence, letting each one land before moving to the next. Victoria's firm controlled the majority of Crosswell's voting shares. The conference venue itself belonged to a hospitality portfolio managed under the same family trust. Even the private security company Adrian had ordered to remove his pregnant wife the night before ultimately answered, several contracts down the line, to an organization she controlled from a quiet office no one at that table had ever visited. Dr. Foster spoke next, addressing the board directly rather than Adrian. She confirmed, for the record, that she had personally witnessed part of the confrontation the previous evening, and that the public statement released afterward did not match anything she had seen with her own eyes. She added, without any particular unkindness in her tone, that she had chaired this summit for 6 years and had never once seen a sponsor treated the way Victoria had been treated inside a building her own family financed. Victoria addressed him directly, her voice steady enough to carry across the entire room without ever needing to rise above a normal conversation. "Yesterday, you had me removed from a building my family owns, during a conference my company financed, while protecting a woman you paid with money that was never yours to spend." No one in the room said a word. Somewhere near the far end of the table, a board member set down his pen very carefully, as if the sound of it might interrupt something important. An older board member, a man who had sat on that table since the company's earliest days, finally broke the silence. "Mr. Cross," he said slowly, "is any part of what she's describing untrue?" Adrian opened his mouth to answer, and found, for the first time in 15 years of practiced answers, that he had nothing prepared to say. Victoria then played the complete security footage for the board, without commentary, letting every person present watch Vanessa start the confrontation, watch her knock the ultrasound gift out of Victoria's hand, and watch Adrian quietly order the recording erased only minutes after it happened, his voice flat and businesslike on the recording, in a way that made several board members visibly recoil. Then the forensic audit appeared on the screen behind her. It documented misused corporate funds stretching back more than a year, luxury travel disguised as legitimate business expenses, the $12 million transfer routed through Vanessa's own brother, private messages discussing how Adrian intended to divorce Victoria shortly after the conference concluded, and a separate set of messages revealing Vanessa's own plan to disappear with her share of the money the moment the transfer finally cleared. A plan that never once mentioned Adrian's name past the point where the money changed hands. Raymond read one line aloud, without embellishment, letting the room hear it exactly as it had been written. In a message sent 2 weeks before the conference, Adrian had told Vanessa that once the transfer cleared, they would finally be able to stop pretending. In a separate message sent only 3 days later, Vanessa had told her brother that Adrian would be, in her own words, easy enough to leave behind once the money was somewhere he couldn't reach it. Neither of them, it seemed, had ever fully trusted the other, even while building the same plan together. Vanessa turned on Adrian almost immediately, her voice cracking as she insisted in front of the entire board that he had personally approved every part of it, that none of it had been her idea alone. Adrian, in turn, insisted just as loudly that Vanessa had manipulated him from the very beginning of their relationship, that she had orchestrated everything from the first dinner they shared. Victoria allowed neither of them the comfort of shifting responsibility onto the other, letting the silence after each accusation stretch long enough to make its own point. One of the younger board members, still visibly stunned by everything unfolding in front of her, finally asked the question several people in the room seemed to be holding back. "If you controlled this company for 3 years," she said carefully, "why wait until now to say anything at all?" Victoria considered the question honestly before answering. "Because the moment I said something, every decision he made afterward would be about me, not about who he actually was underneath all of it. I needed to see the truth without my name attached to it. Last night, I finally did." The board member nodded slowly, and no one else asked the question again. Her response was deliberate, lawful, and entirely without cruelty, even after everything they had put her through over the past 24 hours. Adrian was removed as chief executive, pending a full and independent investigation. Vanessa was terminated immediately for gross misconduct, effective within the hour, her building access revoked before she had even left the executive floor. The fraudulent transfer was permanently blocked and fully reversed back into company accounts. All evidence was turned over to the appropriate authorities without delay or negotiation. An independent executive team was appointed on the spot to protect ongoing operations and every single employee's livelihood through the transition. Vanessa asked, her voice cracking, whether she would at least be allowed to collect her things from her office. She was told, politely but firmly, that her personal belongings would be shipped to whatever address she provided, and that she would not be returning to that floor again under any circumstances. Victoria stood and addressed the room one final time before ending the meeting. No employee will lose their job because of decisions they had no part in making. Then she told Adrian, calmly and without a trace of theater, that she had already filed for divorce before walking into that room that morning, the paperwork sitting in Raymond's briefcase along with everything else. Adrian sat with that for a long moment, staring at the folder of evidence still open on the table in front of him, replaying every small decision that had carried him to this exact chair. He thought of the night she had held him while he cried over a company he believed was already finished, and he understood, perhaps for the first time with any real clarity, that the woman who had comforted him that night and the woman standing in front of him now had never actually been two different people at all. He had simply never once bothered to look closely enough to notice the difference didn't exist. "Why didn't you just tell me?" he asked, his voice low enough that it barely reached past the two of them. "Any of it. 3 years ago. Last year. Even yesterday morning." "Because the moment I told you," Victoria said, "you would have started performing gratitude instead of just being yourself. I wanted the man across the table from me, not a man managing an investor. And what did you find? Now that you've had 3 years to watch?" Victoria considered the question honestly, the way she considered most things. "I found a man who worked harder than almost anyone I've ever known, and I found a man who stopped noticing me the moment he decided he'd earned all of it alone. Both of those men are you, Adrian. I just finally stopped waiting for only one of them to show up." He asked her, quietly, whether she had ever truly loved him at all, his voice smaller than she had heard it in years. Victoria answered without hesitation, though her voice softened for the first time since the meeting began. "I loved the man who told me character mattered more than money. I just didn't realize that man disappeared the moment he thought the money already belonged to him." Adrian had no answer for that. For several seconds, neither of them said anything at all, and the silence between them said more than either version of the conversation they might have had. As security escorted Vanessa from the executive floor, she stopped at the door and pulled her arm free just long enough to turn back toward the table. "You all think I'm the only one who planned something," she said, her voice steady despite everything. "Ask him what he found in his own filing cabinet 8 months ago. Ask him why he suddenly started asking me about prenuptial agreements he'd never once mentioned before." She revealed, in that moment, one final piece of the story, that no one in the room, not even Victoria, had fully expected to hear. Adrian had known, for several months before the conference, that Victoria's family name carried more weight than the modest inheritance she had always described. He had discovered an old legal document linking her to the Langford Trust while going through unrelated paperwork in a filing cabinet at home, and he had begun quietly planning a divorce, specifically because he believed marriage would eventually entitle him to a share of money he had only just learned existed. What he had never discovered, not once in those months of quiet planning, was how deep that connection actually ran. He never learned that Victoria herself, not some distant cousin or silent trustee, personally chaired Langford Capital. He never suspected that the anonymous investor who had rescued Crosswell 3 years earlier was his own wife. He had found a loose thread and pulled on it just enough to plan a divorce around it, without ever once realizing he was standing on top of the very foundation his career had been built on. His relationship with Vanessa had never been only an affair born of loneliness or wounded ego. Together, the two of them had spent months searching for a way to pressure Victoria into signing a revised marital agreement before he ever filed the paperwork himself, one that would give him a legitimate claim to money he assumed was simply a quiet family cushion, nothing close to what it actually was. The humiliation at the conference had been designed, in part, to make Victoria appear unstable enough that any claims she might make later would be easy for a court to dismiss outright. Vanessa's attack, however, had never been part of that careful plan. It had happened entirely on its own, out of raw jealousy she could no longer control in the moment, and it had exposed everything else far earlier than either of them ever intended it to come out. Victoria absorbed this final revelation without visible shock, though something behind her eyes shifted permanently in that moment, settling into place like a lock finally turning. Adrian had not simply betrayed her with another woman. He had spent months quietly constructing a version of events that could later be used against her, in exactly the kind of legal fight she now controlled from every possible angle available to her. Raymond had served the Langford family for 30 years, first as her father's attorney, and later as the one person Victoria trusted completely, with decisions too heavy to carry alone. He had watched her grow from a serious, quiet teenager into a woman who guarded her own heart the same careful way her father had once guarded his company's. He had never once told her what to do with her marriage, only what her options were if she ever needed them, and on this particular morning, she needed every one of them at once. Raymond confirmed what she had already begun to suspect. The original marital agreement, signed years earlier out of a desire to know whether she was loved for who she was rather than what she owned, protected the Langford Trust completely. Adrian would receive no claim to any part of it, regardless of how the divorce proceeded from that point forward, regardless of how many lawyers he hired to try. Raymond later read the settlement terms aloud to Adrian in a quiet conference room away from the cameras that had already begun gathering outside the building. Victoria was not seeking punitive damages, he explained. She wanted only what the original agreement already guaranteed her, nothing more and nothing less, along with full cooperation in the ongoing investigation. Adrian signed without contesting a single line, having finally understood that there was no version of a fight he could still win. Outside the building, a small crowd of reporters had already gathered, drawn by rumors spreading faster than anyone could contain them. Adrian left through a service entrance rather than face a single camera, a choice that would become, in its own quiet way, the last decision he made as the public face of a company that no longer wanted him standing in front of it. The only item Victoria asked to keep from that entire ordeal was the damaged gift box still sitting among the evidence spread across the table, its cardboard corner crushed, the ultrasound photograph inside slightly bent but fully intact. She picked it up carefully, held it against her chest for a moment, and walked out of the room without looking back at either of them, her footsteps the only sound in the hallway outside. Behind her, the room slowly began to move again, chairs shifting, voices returning in careful, lowered tones, the ordinary business of a company continuing on without the two people who had spent the last day trying to control it for themselves. Dr. Foster caught up with her briefly in the hallway, resting a hand on her arm just long enough to tell her that whatever came next, the board stood fully behind her. Victoria thanked her quietly and kept walking. By the time the elevator doors closed in front of her, neither Adrian nor Vanessa were anywhere she needed to think about again that day, and for the first time in longer than she could easily remember, the quiet in her own mind felt like peace instead of something she had to work to maintain. Several months later, Victoria gave birth to a healthy daughter, surrounded by people who had genuinely earned the right to be there with her, Raymond among them, holding the baby with the careful pride of a man who had watched her mother grow up decades earlier. She named her daughter Harper after no one in particular, simply because it was a name that belonged only to the two of them, untouched by anything that had come before. For the first time in her adult life, Victoria stepped forward publicly as the leader of Langford Capital, no longer content to manage her family's legacy from behind a curtain of careful, protective privacy that had cost her more than she once realized it could. She gave a short interview to a business journal that year, the first she had ever agreed to, and when asked what advice she would give to other people quietly carrying more than the world around them realized, she said only that patience was not the same thing as permission, and that anyone paying close enough attention would eventually show you exactly who they were. Crosswell Technologies survived under its new independent leadership, wounded but intact, its stock steadying within a matter of weeks. Employees kept their jobs and gained stronger protections for anyone willing to report wrongdoing honestly in the future, a policy Victoria insisted on personally before stepping back from day-to-day oversight. One young engineer, interviewed months later by a local business paper, said simply that for the first time since she'd joined the company, she felt like the people running it actually noticed when something wasn't right, and actually did something about it. Daniel Brooks, the one executive who had refused to approve a single fraudulent transfer no matter how much pressure came down on him, was named interim chief executive after cooperating fully with every part of the investigation, his written objections held up in the end as the clearest proof that not everyone in that building had lost their way. In his first address to the full staff, standing at the same podium Adrian had once used for keynote rehearsals, Daniel told employees simply that the company's new standard going forward would be plain and unglamorous. If something looked wrong on paper, someone was going to ask about it out loud, no matter whose name was attached to the approval. Adrian faced both civil and corporate consequences that followed him well beyond the boardroom, along with the loss of a reputation he had spent 15 careful years building in public, one interview and one magazine cover at a time. The same outlets that once called him a visionary now covered the investigation in far less flattering terms, and the speaking invitations that had once filled his calendar stopped arriving entirely within a matter of weeks. He moved to a smaller city, took a quieter role at a company that didn't recognize his name on sight, and, according to people who still spoke with him occasionally, spent a long time trying to understand exactly which of his own choices had cost him everything. Vanessa learned, in the end, that ambition without integrity had left her with neither the man she had chased nor the fortune she had spent years quietly planning to inherit alongside him. The criminal complaint against her moved forward regardless of how the divorce settled, and the industry she had spent a decade building a name in was considerably smaller and less forgiving than she had ever imagined it could be. Victoria did not celebrate their downfall, though she had every reason available to her to feel something like satisfaction. Her victory was simpler than revenge ever could be. It was reclaiming her own name, protecting her child, and refusing, even after everything that had been done to her, to let betrayal turn her into someone cruel. Years from now, when her daughter is old enough to ask about the ring Victoria no longer wears, or about the small, worn photograph kept safe in a drawer despite its crushed corner, Victoria intends to tell her the truth plainly, without bitterness, the way her own father once spoke to her about difficult things. She will tell her that some people show you exactly who they are the moment they believe no one important is watching, and that the wisest thing anyone can do is pay attention when that happens, rather than explain it away. In the weeks that followed, Victoria found that the hardest part was not the divorce paperwork or the investigation updates that arrived on her desk almost daily, but the quieter task of learning who she was outside of a marriage she had spent 7 years protecting at her own expense. She was surprised, more than once, by how much lighter that process felt than she had expected it to feel. Victoria's fortune gave her power, but money was never truly what defeated Adrian and Vanessa in the end. Their own decisions did that entirely on their own, one small choice at a time, long before any board meeting ever needed to happen. They mistook her silence for weakness, mistook her privacy for dependence, and mistook her kindness for permission to take whatever they wanted without ever facing a single consequence for it. If you were standing in Victoria's position the moment that ballroom went silent, would you have revealed the truth immediately, right there in front of everyone, or would you have waited, the way she did, long enough to let everyone else expose exactly who they really were on their own? And who do you think betrayed her more in the end? The mistress who attacked her in public without a moment of hesitation, or the husband who stood beside that mistress and calmly ordered his own pregnant wife removed from the room he owed everything to? Share your verdict in the comments below and tell us where you're watching this from tonight. And if stories about hidden identities, quiet betrayal, and justice, arriving exactly when nobody expects it, are the kind of thing you enjoy, subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss the next one.